So, Thrones of Britannia is out, and having played a little bit of it in the short time that it has been available, both campaign and just messing around in custom maps, I figured that the first thing I would do, rather than any sort of multiplayer battles or even any possible campaigns, would be to return to my roots a little bit and do a top 5, not a top 10, because ultimately, while there would be enough units to do a top 10 in each individual category, that would essentially include most of the units in several of them. So for example, the first category I'm going to take a look at is going to be the Great Axe or DANE Axe units, the shock infantry that wields a large two-handed battle axe. And if I were to do a top 10, that would include most of those units that are in the game, at least, you know, because several, obviously the cultural groups tend to share individual units as well. So I'm going to do a top 5. And that will ultimately lead to a little bit more of a condensed list, yes, but I feel as though that's going to be most useful because it's at the high end where I think most people will want to see stuff. So we shall jump in at number 5. And so we start off with the Gallo Glasses, a unique unit to the Central Irish Gaelic faction of Meath. And it is worth saying that this unit would not have made the list had I included General's Bodyguard units that wield a two-handed DANE axe. But I decided to exclude them because the way they work is very different, and more often than not they will be using their abilities on the battlefield to drastically influence what actually goes on. So I figured I would just do standard units for these lists, and I would do a different, sort of separate look at the General's Bodyguards a little bit later on. As for the Gallo Glasses themselves though, they do break the mould a little bit of the Gaelic factions in that it is a somewhat unique thing for them to have such a shock unit. Most of the Gaelic roster is focused a little bit more around skirmishing, hit and run, and their spear units. But it was said that the King of Meath did employ Viking mercenaries in order to try and subjugate his neighbours, so his men learnt the lessons of their Viking neighbours very well. And to have a look at their stats, they have a melee skill of 38, a melee damage of 50, a charge bonus of 57, of course a shield value of 0, an armour of 32, a morale of 49, and a man count of 120. Now what lets them down a little bit next to their peers on this list is the fact that they do have a lower melee skill and a lower melee damage and a lower charge bonus. All of these things, of course, are incredibly important for a shock unit. Having said that, they are still better than the vast majority of the sort of mid-tier shock units, and you could view the Gallo Glasses as a sort of entry-level, high-tier shock infantry unit. And they do very well. They can also form wedge formation, which of course will drastically increase their charge bonus, but will also lower their melee attack. So there's obviously a risk-reward kind of thing, but for the most part, shock units, it's very worthwhile putting them into wedge formation, I've noticed in the few battles I've played so far, because the damage you can do off the charge is extremely significant, and of course the Gallo Glasses are going to be like that. And having a little closer look at their armour, of course, a lot of the factions will bear quite a lot of similarities in terms of style. You can see that the Gallo Glasses, that guy just put away his axe. In fact, it looks as though a lot of them are starting to put away their weaponry. But it looks, you know, they obviously have taken a lot of inspiration from their Viking neighbours in terms of their style as well, with the spectacle helms, and also they are wearing sort of a basic chainmail sort of cuirass. I quite like the Gallo Glasses in terms of style. They are a little bit plain compared to some of the later units on this list, but nonetheless they do give another option, because I have a feeling as Thrones of Britannia, as a meta starts to develop in multiplayer and in single player in the campaigns, for the most part the Gaelic factions will be very hit and run. But with a very high pressure unit like this, you could well back them up with swordsmen and take your enemy by surprise and be aggressive. So yeah, that is the Gallo Glasses. If we have a look, you can see there are their stats just here, and they can form that wedge, but other than that, that is just about everything. So now we shall move on to number 4. So now we start to get into the Viking dominance in this area, naturally. Historically, it's very iconic that they utilise axes, so it makes a lot of sense that they would dominate the top of a list like this. And starting at number 4, we have the basic Viking Huskars. These are units that are available to both of the Danelaw factions, so Northumbria and East Angle. Thank you, announcer. But having a look at their stats, we can see that they have a stat line of 45 melee skill, 65 melee damage, 67 charge bonus, of course again 0 shields. The officers have got shields, but the vast bulk of the infantry does not. An armour of 22, and a morale of 52. So the only area in which they have less than the Gallo Glasses before them are armour, and they do have a significant amount of armour less, but for the most part, you know, their offensive capabilities far outclass that of the Irish Pretenders. And this is only the most basic version of the Huskarl units that the Vikings have available to them, or the Viking cultural Viking faction, shall we say. And they are only available to the Danelaw factions, but they aren't a unique unit like the Gallo Glasses. But if we have a look at just the style of these units, they are a little bit more impressive. Ooh, clipping through his head there. You can see the helms, the mail as well. They look very, very intimidating. And this is only the most basic Huskarl unit, so we will be moving on to bigger and better things in just a moment. But again, in terms of how they will work in exactly the same way. Shock infantry is one of the most simplistic forms of unit. You just charge them in, they do a lot of damage off the charge, but ultimately they will start to lose steam pretty quickly if they aren't backed up, especially if they're in wedge formation, because the lack of melee skill that such a formation gives them does hurt them in the long run quite a bit. But if you can smash an infantry line to bits very quickly, of course, it's very worth your time. Well, worth your time to do such a thing. Obviously here we've got the Northumbrian colours, but East Anglia also have these units available to them. Definitely a very intimidating force on the battlefield, but the Danelaw factions do have better options available to them, which we will get onto in just a moment. But for the time being, we shall move on to number 3. And so now we move on to the strongest shock infantry unit actually that the Viking Sea Kings can field, the Eastman Huskarl. So it is a unit that is confined to Sudriyar and Difflin. Just having a look at, well, we'll have a look at what they look like in a moment, but having a look at their stat line, very similar to the last ones. They have a melee skill of 49, melee damage of 65, a charge bonus of 74, which is actually the joint highest, so that's one reason why they're held in higher regard than the standard Huskarls, despite having less armour. Well, actually no, they have the same amount of armour, but they have 22 armour, which is of course still less than the Gallo Glasses way back down in 5th. They also have a morale of 56. Although that is buffed slightly by the general being alive and nearby, so it's actually 54 in practice. So yeah, slightly better than the standard Huskarls, but honestly not all that much. The Sea Kings though have got a lot more of a focus on raiding. You can see that several of them don't even have boots on, so obviously definitely with a focus on a naval landing here, charging up a beach as quickly as possible, not wanting their boots to get waterlogged, some of them. And they do have a very different style. They have an almost Scottish style in many ways, obviously with the Tartan, or well, more of a Gaelic influence, I suppose. It's not just the Vikings that influenced the British Isles; it was vice versa as well. So obviously with them, with the plaid little cloths around them, I don't think they look quite as intimidating as the standard Huskarls that came before them, but they will do exactly the same sort of job. Obviously, again, in a very similar fashion, they will of course form wedge if you need them to. And obviously this will have the effect of lowering their melee skill, so they will last considerably less time in melee if you do that, but obviously it's going to be the main focus of these units is to smash the enemy lines to bits as quickly as they possibly can. It's actually interesting that the Viking Sea Kings have got less of an emphasis on this sort of thing, and the Great Viking Army has got more of an emphasis on it, as we shall see as we move on up into the second and first spots on the list. But the Sea Kings, I suppose, more of an emphasis on raiding, so they want to be in and out as quickly as they possibly can, and more of an emphasis on ships as well. Obviously, I haven't got very far in the campaign, but the Viking Sea Kings are actually who I'm playing in my single-player campaign that I've started. I'm playing as Sudriyar, so we shall see if the Viking Sea Kings have got their strengths in other areas in the late game. But they still have some strong shock infantry nonetheless, and they do look pretty cool as well. I like the fact that, despite the fact all of the factions are overall quite similar, they do have little details which set them apart. So obviously with the Sea Kings, they've got lighter armour, more of an emphasis on looking like raiders than they are looking like professional soldiers. But we now move on into the upper echelons, into the silver medal position. So now we make a return back to Danelaw, and this is a unit they actually share with the Norse Invader faction as well. We have the Jarl's Huskarls, and essentially they are just a buffed version of the standard Huskarls. Slightly more expensive, but also slightly better. They have the same melee skill, damage and charge bonus, I believe, if not slightly higher in some of those aspects. But they also have a higher armor value of 27, and that's really all there is to say about the Jarl's Huskarls. They are just a buffed version of the standard ones. And they do outperform the Eastman Huskarls, which, considering this is actually only the middling Huskarl unit of the Danelaw and the Norse Invader factions, they actually far outstrip the Viking Sea Kings in terms of an overall shock infantry unit. Actually, if we have, and you know, in terms of style, they are very, very similar to the standard Huskarls. There's some very small differences, I think, but obviously in terms of colour, this is because I'm just showcasing the East Engel colours this time, so more blues and yellows as opposed to light reds, and you know, the Viking style has always been very, very intimidating, and yeah, obviously not much more to say about the Jarl's Huskarls. They are a very strong infantry unit though, and I was actually quite surprised when they outperformed the Eastman Huskarls, because the Eastman Huskarls are superior in some ways. They have higher melee skill and they have a higher charge bonus, and I thought that would actually stand them in pretty good stead. But ultimately the increased armor and the increased, well yeah, just the increased armor alone was able to see them through. So it does go to show that despite the fact these are very much an armor piercing focused unit, having a significant amount of armor more than your opponent will stand you in good stead in this game. So that is something worth bearing in mind as we move forward into some of the other more defensive unit types. I think I'll be doing the Swordsman after this one, for example. But yeah, Jarl's Huskarls screaming, yeah! But now we'll move on to first place, which is actually shared between 3 units that have identical stats. So we'll go through each of them individually in terms of style. So, as I said, this top spot is shared between 3 units of identical stats, and first of all we have the Danelaw Huskarls. We'll go through the stat line now, and then we'll just go through each of them stylistically afterwards, because that's really the only difference between them. They each have a melee skill of 49, a melee damage of 65, charge bonus of 74, no shield of course, an armor of 32, and a morale of, well, usually 54, but obviously it's 56 because of the proximity of the general and him still being alive. It is worth saying that the Eastman Huskarls are essentially the same unit, only they have 10 less armor, and that is what sets the best Viking Sea King shock unit apart, aside from the 3 units that we have here. And having a look at the Eastman Huskarls, we may as well just have a look at them stylistically. They do look a little bit different from the Jarl's Huskarls and the standard Huskarls. Their helms and their armour looks a little bit more sturdily constructed, which makes sense because really the armour value is the only thing about them which is different. Obviously, mechanically they're going to work exactly the same. Wedge charge in for that glass cannon effect, or just leave them out of wedge and they still have a very strong charge bonus indeed. This guy's got a nice and intimidating looking helm. Very nice unit indeed. And obviously this is the strongest unit that Danelaw have available to them, and unlike the previous Danelaw Huskarls, this is a unit which is entirely unique to them. The Norse have a different unit which we'll get onto in a moment, but this is of course the Danelaw Huskarls. So yeah, now we shall move on to, we may as well have a look at the Norse Invader, the Norse Invader shock infantry unit that they have, which has exactly the same stat line, but they do have a different name and a slightly different style, I believe. And so now we come to the mailed Huskarls, of course, mechanically completely the same as the Danelaw Huskarls. You can see that they have the same stat line here. But if we go into cinematic mode, you can see that really the style difference is quite noticeable. They do have a different colour scheme going on, a little bit more brass, a little bit more gold going on, and that is what sets them apart, really. I mean, you can tell that the detail on them is pretty impressive, actually. But the Norse Invader faction is something which you will encounter in campaign as part of the ultimate victory settings. You won't be able to play them in campaign, but they will, once you reach your long campaign goal, they will invade you. So it'll be like 1066, where you're invaded by a Norwegian and a Norman army, and they will come for your kingdom at the same time. And this is going to be one of the units you're going to have to deal with in the Norwegian invasion fleet, or the Norse invasion fleet, I should say. Because they are going to be very, very powerful, of course. You may have the same units that can match them one-to-one. If you're Danelaw, for example, your Huskarls will be able to basically cancel each other out. But it is still a very nice-looking unit. I think I prefer the colour scheme on the Scandinavian Huskarls here, the Norse Huskarls, as opposed to the slightly more plain Danelaw ones. But even so, still a very nice-looking unit. But we still have one more unit left to go. And this is actually not a Viking unit, despite the fact that every unit so far, except the Gallo Glasses from Ireland, have been a Viking unit. The top spot is actually at least shared by a Saxon unit. So let's go and take a look at that. So once again, we have exactly the same stat line, but we have the Royal Huskarls here, the Saxons, and this is the West Saxa version of them, so this will be the men marching under Alfred the Great's banner. And again, stylistically, they may not look all that much different to the Viking units that we've seen so far, but that does make a good deal of sense, because really there wasn't a huge difference between the fighting armies and men at the time, but they do still have some differences to them. Like you can see, there are more gold effects here. There's also some Saxon sort of, very Saxon stylistic sort of, I don't know what you'd call these, but you know, the decorations on the armour when you get up close are more Saxon than they are Viking when you look at the Royal Huskarls. But if anything, I saved the Royal Huskarls for last, because technically speaking they are the best of these because they are the cheapest. So if you're looking from a cost efficiency standpoint, the Royal Huscarls from the Saxon Kingdoms would actually be the strongest shock infantry in the game. But as it is, I'm just looking purely at the stats because it is hard to tell. That's from a multiplayer perspective, but it is hard to tell from a campaign or a multiplayer perspective. I don't really want to sort of differentiate them too much here because this is obviously, the game's only just come out, so it'll take some time for a meta to be established in both. But in terms of a stat line, they are exactly the same as the two units we've seen before, but being cheaper as time goes on, they may well prove to be a more cost-effective unit, and you may well see them a little bit more in online play, certainly. But it remains to be seen how easy they are to get in campaign as well. But certainly a very strong unit, and they share the top spot. So, we have borne witness to the top 5, although it is, of course, technically speaking, a top 7, considering that the top spot was shared by 3 mechanically identical units. But the Dane axe was a very fearsome weapon. It remained a fixture in the English armies for quite some time after that, and even into the medieval era, the pole axe was quite a popular weapon for foot-bound English knights, so the Vikings definitely left their mark in terms of the kind of weaponry that the native peoples like to use. Not that the Saxons were native, of course, but you get the point. So, that is the Great Axe Infantry. I think the next one I would do would be the Swordsman, and that may well take a little bit more time testing, because with the Shock Infantry, of course, it was a very simple case of seeing how well they did against one another, how well they did off the charge as well, and just after a bit of messing around, it is a very straightforward task to sort of pick out the best and worst in the more modern Total Wars, because it is a lot more straightforward in terms of their stats, whereas with Medieval, of course, and especially with Reforged now, considering the kind of depth they've got going on, it would take a great deal more time to differentiate the units. But as for here, that is the top 5. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next, which may very well be the start of a multiplayer campaign. I don't think I'll show a single player campaign, purely because I don't think I've got the charisma to carry quite a long series like that off. But with a multiplayer campaign, hopefully we can get a good look at how that works in this game, because of course it has the potential to be quite interesting to see a Viking-Saxon rivalry, or even something like the Gaelic factions in the north. Remains to be seen what happens, because it might well be a 3-player multiplayer campaign I do. As I said, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.